thank you all for coming along, and I know we're still not officially into the term, and you still manage, so thank you. And thank you, Kiran, for coming along. She's visiting from Vancouver all the way. She's been traveling for the last 3 months, and so we are very honored to have you here and talk to us about something that is in a bit of a crisis right now. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am, and we are all sitting on the land of the Nungawal people and the Dharawal people, and that I acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. I also acknowledge the Uluru statement that the sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and that the struggle for justice on these stolen lands continue. I will briefly, it's almost impossible to put in just a small paragraph the wonderful, wonderful work that Kiran has been doing over the last 2 decades, but I will try, a humble try. So Kiran Nazish is an award-winning journalist and the founding director of the Coalition for Women in Journalism, a global support network that advocates for the safety, rights, and career advancement of women and gender-diverse journalists around the world. So over the last many, many years, she has been, through her advocacy, involved in resettling a lot of female journalists from authoritarian states or those in exile. So Kiran will be talking about that more later. Kiran's career spans over 2 decades. She has reported from conflict zones, from Middle East, South Asia, Latin America, and for leading international outlets such as the New York Times, Al Jazeera, BBC, and the list goes on. So drawing from her own experiences of working under dangerous and often discriminatory conditions, she launched the Coalition for Women in Journalism in 2017 to address the systemic inequalities that threatens the women and their face in the media. The coalition has grown into a powerful international movement providing mentorship, emergency support, and advocacy to journalists in more than 130 countries. Kiran's work is rooted in deep commitment to press freedom, gender justice, and journalistic integrity. So I would like you all to give her a round of applause.
That was a very extensive introduction.
A humble one. I would stress one more time. So I'm going to ask her a few questions. We're just going to have a candid conversation, and then we will move on to you guys, and you can ask your questions. So Kiran, I've divided these into several sections, and I think it's needless to say that I would like to start with your experience, 20 years of experience from conflict zone, working in conflict zones, but also with people who flee conflict zones from around the world. So how have you seen press freedom erode on the ground?
Good question. I thought you were going to start with, obviously, authoritarianism, right? But even if you go back 20 years, what we see is authoritarianism. So I started my career in Pakistan, right? Right after, like around 9/11, I was an intern at Dawn. If anyone's from Pakistan, you'd be familiar. And in the year 2000, so at that time we were preparing for the millennium, like it was 1999. So we were preparing for the millennium and the future was bright, and suddenly 9/11 happens, and then Pakistan became the ally, the first and the foremost frontline ally in the war against terrorism. And journalism there kind of suddenly changed. There were good and bad things happening, but what was happening also was kind of in something that had been sort of a dictatorship, right? Like in Pakistan, the military establishment had always had power, one way or the other, even during democratic governments. That was always a struggle, but what we saw was symptoms of dictatorship, very similar symptoms that we are seeing now in Eastern Europe, Belarus, Poland, etc., Russia, obviously. We are also now going to see a lot of that happen in the United States. And so around that time, I think I kind of grew up in an environment, I got trained in an environment where journalists who were ahead of me had already gone to prison in the 80s and early 90s, there were these things where legal harassment was common, journalists going into prison under other military, I would call them dictators now. It's easy to say that, it wasn't at the time. So a lot of those symptoms were there, and I think around the world, press freedom was always kind of under, attack. Unless you were covering, since World War II, when there was a boom of press freedom and democracy, we saw that some parts of the world, we thought there was healthy press freedom, but that was mostly where foreign journalists were going and covering other parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, and we saw some sort of fair coverage globally. But we always had some sort of a press freedom, that was neglected in most parts of the world, including the United States. And somebody was telling me, like, when I was starting this, like, we were doing the survey. So before I started the coalition, I was war correspondent at the time. I was covering Syria when we were about to launch, and then it was just like a lot going on with women as well in the field. And we did a survey, and we spoke to 101 editors and journalists, mostly in North America, in different newsrooms, and some in Mexico and Canada, Mexico, and the US. And we found that there were a lot of things that came up about gender inequality, etc. But a lot of those things that came up were about press freedom. That in smaller towns in the United States, as well, there was censorship. The mayor would not allow a journalist to cover something in a smaller town. So press freedom has always been a target. Journalists do important work where they reveal important facts, and that has always been a threat to somebody. What we are seeing now is essentially an escalation of what was already happening and was not dealt with fairly. And I just want to clarify that we started as a mentorship organization in 2017. It was a pro bono organization. And in 2019, we launched the Press Freedom Initiative precisely because we saw that women journalists who were in our networks in India, in Turkey, in the Netherlands, were getting targeted. One of our mentees got arrested in India, so we had to organize somebody to get her out on a bail. So we were a mentorship organization and a pro bono organization, but press freedom attacks were happening, and we started getting involved in getting women journalists out of those really serious press freedom attacks. And they did not have support internationally by other international organizations. And that was because women were neglected. So we started the press freedom work in 2019.
Right.
And so it's been like, last year we did a 5-year report on, what the 5 years looks like.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You, in your, response to my earlier question, you've been mentioning the US and other seemingly progressive countries where there's more freedom of speech, at least on paper. And so we have, as you also mentioned, we've seen that being a democratic country or a democratic system does not automatically, give freedom of press to journalists or freedom of voice. I mean, censorship, as you said, has always been there. Since the beginning of voice, there is always someone who's trying to suppress that voice. But I would be it's simpler to understand when it happens in authoritarian countries in terms of, okay, why is it happening and why are they being stopped? But I often get, my students often ask me, can a democratic country actually be an authoritarian country in some sense as well? And sometimes it becomes very difficult to explain these boundaries. So what then happens to press freedom when there are laws when there's legislation that protects the freedom of press, but at the same time, in a democratic country, there are attacks. So, let's just say.
So we just, I think the idea of democracy is an assumed idea, is what we're learning now. That, press freedom or any kind of freedoms has been an assumed idea that we have understood since post-World War II, when we came into this, in the last few decades, we've just assumed that democracy exists. We live in democracies. We've been going out and voting, and that all of that infrastructure, that there's law and order and all that stuff. But we are also seeing in the last few decades that none of the institutions work, not only journalism, but also law enforcement. democracy itself, the whole, the system of voting in any country in the world, right? Can I ask, like, if three students could tell me where they're from in different parts of the world?
I come from Indonesia.
Indonesia.
We come from China.
Okay, great. You guys know everything we're talking about today.
India.
Okay, awesome.
Sanskrit.
I was born in India and lived in Singapore.
Awesome. Singapore is slightly better, but not really.
Not at all,
But you're kind of like on Indonesia has a lot of press freedom problems, and so press freedom and democracy obviously go hand in hand. I think like 5 years ago this was kind of a debate, but like now everyone knows that. So to come back to your question, like how do we know that we are in a democracy is not when we say that it is a democracy, right? We know that we are in a democracy when everyone does have democratic rights, which means that you would have right to information, and you would have right to demonstration, and you have other rights like, healthcare, whatever your country can afford if you're in the global south, or etc. Right? There's, in India, you don't necessarily have all the same kind of facilities that democracies are essentially supposed to provide, but you have the basic stuff, right? Which involves rights and freedoms. And so, like coming back to the assumed idea that we assume that it's a democracy and we assume that we have press freedom until it's tested. Right now, we are seeing that it's being tested. I am in Canada. We are actually US based. I moved to Canada for personal reasons, but in every democratic country, and before actually coming here, we did a Europe advocacy trip. And we met several European leaders, the President of the European Parliament, European Commission, etc. And everyone in Europe right now is really struggling with the idea of democracy and press freedom. Because, again, it's an assumed idea that you have to practice democracy and press freedom, which when it's tested, that's when we get to practice it, right? And I think right now it's being tested as the world becomes more polarized, that people, not necessarily, all of the population around the world today agrees or understands democracy or press freedom, right? There's barely any people who, in this moment of time, in the age of misinformation and polarization, who appreciate journalists or even understand what journalism is, right? People have suspicions about what journalism itself is, right? So, in that world, it is very hard to understand, press freedom, to even like say that press freedom is something that is important for public good. So then, how do we understand what is democracy, what is press freedom? And, I was going on a tangent, but like, I hope that
That definitely it adds to overall understanding of how to see press freedom or democracy in countries that are relatively progressive. And then as you know, and most of the people here know, my area of research is war and media and war and conflict. And I've been closely monitoring how narratives around certain wars are being built. And when we say journalism, we're not only looking at mainstream journalism, we're talking about social media as well, in a way where it is, social media journalists or citizen journalists. And then I see, just like the weaponization of victimhood, for instance, there's weaponization of democracy, but also weaponization of press freedom. So journalists are allowed to say something when it's in a certain context, but they're not allowed to say. And I think that goes back to when you were talking about people don't trust journalism. What is journalism? Who's doing the right journalism? And so when I was making a list of some questions, I thought, so whose press freedom are we fighting for? So whose press freedom is important?
So, what do you mean by whose press freedom? You mean?
Who's that who?
You mean who's a journalist? Is that what you mean?
Who are journalists speaking for?
Right.
And who are they free to speak for and not?
So it's relative, right? So in a very polarized world, I think even a decade ago, countries like India and Pakistan. It's like maybe 15 years ago, I was in India, I was teaching at a university, and I started a small journalism school there. Anyway, so that's how I learned about like what was going on there. But like India, Pakistan, Mexico, a lot of Latin American countries, it's been 15, 20 years since some parts of the world are already kind of divided. You know, there's polarization there already. So what happens in that environment is, you know, under dictators or oligarchs or drug cartels or corruption, all of the same stuff, non-state actors, whether it's Taliban in power or it's some, you know, in Mexico what's happening, you know, where the drug cartels kind of work with the state, you know, in the background. What happens is that the media runs on its public good. It needs resources. So what happens is that media is partially taken over by those who have more resources, those who have more power. And that system for decades has been collapsing what journalism itself can do. But, you know, 2 decades ago or 1.5 decades ago, we used to see a lot of journalists in Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, like Belarus, Poland, etc., would work in tandem with foreign media, where you would have some semblance of doing independent journalism, because I think foreign media played a huge role in some parts of the world where we could have alternative voices in the mainstream, not only citizen journalism. And that kind of gave some semblance, right? You would see a lot of exiled journalists living all over the world, right? And they're able to do the work that they wanted to do, right? But we are seeing that crumble slowly because there has been this idea in the West, including Australia, by the way, that we are better and we got it under control and we, you know, we have been doing journalism, you know, authentically. So they don't really realize, but that thing has been creeping everywhere. You know, Murdoch has so many news channels in Australia. I have heard so much gossip since I got here, by the way.
And I'm sure
about
most of them are
censorship.
true. Sure.
Yeah, the censorship that's going on, you know, all of that stuff. So who is a journalist and whose press freedom it is? It really depends on who runs the media in that country, and so then in 2025, sorry, you know, in this part of second decade of 21st century, we are already seeing that we don't have journalism in the mainstream. Just like our governments, our democracies are hijacked, our journalism has been hijacked.
So would it be right, I mean, would you say that the erosion in press freedom over the years has been because of these problems in democratic institutions, or and
So
that
oftentimes, sometimes people ask me like, is attacks on press, you know, declining press freedom a symptom of, is like the sign that now democracy is crumbling? And I always say it's actually one of the last symptoms. Like, it's actually the last thing that you would see when a government is able to target journalists who are essentially truth tellers. They basically are the direct link between the public and the government and the state. When the state becomes so audacious that it can target journalists, then it already has happened. The crippling has already happened.
maybe
And it's a symptom of that crippling.
or maybe more than a symptom, it's an effect, you know,
Exactly.
of those symptoms that so what happens again, as you were talking about press freedom and press freedom in certain areas, right? For instance, environmental, climate change, for instance. You know, I mean, I know that when we talk about press freedom, the first thing comes to our mind is dissidence and political activism and war, conflict. But there's so many other areas where there's not enough press freedom at hand for the journalist. In addition to conflict, where else have you seen, in which parts of journalism that you think that there needs to be more freedom for journalists to talk about these issues as journalism as a public good?
So I think that I used to be a conflict reporter, right? And when I was covering conflicts, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, like, journalists always had dangers, and our danger usually came from a non-state actor, Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS, etc., right? And sometimes in Mexico it would also come from the government. But, you know, there was a clear line that covering conflict was dangerous, and that's where most of the press freedom attacks would take place. And we would see the rate of, like for example, CPJ or Reporters Without Borders would publish their rankings, where you would see how journalists are getting killed or targeted in a physical kind of manner, right? But in the last decade, what we've seen is that journalists outside of active conflict zones have been targeted with different kinds of things, beginning from intimidation, obviously, but like legal harassment. Like right now, we have 55 categories in which women journalists get targeted, and these 55 categories are not online trolling or smear campaigns. That's one category. We have 54 other categories outside of the digital attacks, which are physical attacks, which includes acid throwing, which includes legal violations, which includes slap cases, which includes governments and the public getting involved in some physical manner to target women and LGBTQ journalists, right? And so that comes from more than the hatred towards journalism. When women journalists get targeted, there's also this factor where people just do not like women, or they don't trust women rather, and that kind of rides into misogyny and other factors like polarization, etc. But I think the polarization itself is the new conflict zone for women journalists, or for journalists generally.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, a few months ago when I was in Berlin looking at exiled journalists who had recently fled Afghanistan, there was this, there were stories not only about how they have been stopped by the Taliban de facto government from doing journalism, but as you said, it just spills into their private lives as well. They were tortured, they were arrested, they were kept, they went missing. And there were many young journalists who came out, and so many were killed as well for, then you go to the genocide that's happening in Gaza right now. Hundreds of journalists have been killed for simply doing the reporting, right?
It's not simply, we like to say it's simply, but actually it's the most dangerous thing to report in a war that is actually not a war.
So can journalists ever then be safe?
I mean, that's a very tough question. I don't want to say no, but the answer is no. Right now, I mean, who's protecting journalists? It's like, I think there was a time 5 years ago, or even like 2 years ago, before the brewing of Donald Trump, things have changed really drastically. So, I think we were moving globally into a time where we were very involved in forming coalitions in different parts of the world with governments in Canada, in Europe, mostly in Europe, Canada, a little bit in the UK, to work with, governments and public officials to, for them to get more involved in the idea of press freedom and protecting women journalists. And there was a lot of work moving, right? In Europe, just like last December, one of the European commissioners had worked very, very hard for several years to pass the European Media Freedom Act, which took years of work and passing the act, right? And then she was retired, and now we have 2 new commissioners who are not interested in that. So that entire 5 years of work that we did, and that they did, these interested public officials who did that work, now that's kind of eradicated in a way, because the new ones are not that interested. And now Europe is more caught up. Just looking at the global dynamic is very important. Countries who still want democracy or press freedom or care about the importance of journalism, including Australia, are caught up in this wave of authoritarianism. And they're really, there's a lot of panic going on all over the world.
Yeah, that's real. I mean,
and dissatisfaction, and another thing that I just want to say that, because Australia just elected someone decent, reasonably, but reasonably, reasonably, like not perfect. And the reason is that we've got really bad choices. The best choices are not perfect right now. Canada just elected somebody decent as well. And we'll see what happens, because everyone has to wrangle with what's happening globally. So is there a possibility for us to keep journalists safe? No. Right now, no, but we need to catch up, really. We have to work really, really fast, which is what we are doing, which is also why I'm here, because we are meeting a lot of different officials to figure out how we can work together, not only on press freedom, because the entire fabric of democracy is kind of shaking, and press freedom is part of that. So we need a strong democracies, and we need to we need people to work together who care about democracy. I want to go back to like just one thing that you mentioned, because students need to know, these are students, and they need to know what are the big issues where journalists get targeted. We are on unceded territory. Indigenous journalists get targeted, like almost everywhere. Australia, any Indigenous journalist I know from here, or Canada, or the United States is targeted. In Canada, it's kind of slightly worse, because the police just literally does not allow journalists to access some of the stories that Indigenous journalists are covering, or if journalists are generally covering stories that have to do with Indigenous people. Number 2, climate change, biggest issue of humanity. That's one of the censored issues where you would see in democratic countries.
Including Australia, the worst, when it comes to.
Well, you go to Canada and the United States and Germany, everyone thinks it's the worst there, because it's really bad everywhere. And we are not seeing law enforcement, for example, to anywhere in the world to respect what journalists do. So that's one of the things. So I think, and I've been lobbying this for a while, no one agrees with me so far, but I think we should really think about it, is that I think that we should have a beat for press freedom, that not only that, journalists should be interested in covering, health and democracy and politics and sports, but also press freedom, and also democracy itself. What's happening in your country with respect to press freedom, and what's behind those stories? Which stories are getting killed? Every year we document around 2,000 cases of women journalists getting targeted. Can you believe it? 2,000 women journalists get targeted around the world every year. And all of those journalists are getting targeted because there's a story behind it. So there are these stories that have to be uncovered. And the second thing is to, if you want to do something to counter press freedom attacks, is to work in collaboration. Not only work in collaboration with journalists in your country, but do interstate collaboration, because that creates a lot of strength in journalism.
No, that's a great point. And I was thinking about community media and diaspora media, journalists in exile. We were talking about those. So an Afghan journalist is not safe in Afghanistan, but is free to report about Afghanistan if they're outside Afghanistan. From a Mexican journalist, say, or somewhere else, and can do it better if they're outside, given that they have the privilege to do it. A Palestinian journalist can report about it better if they're outside. Voice of America was just slashed, right? So first, what does that mean for community media or ethnic media in other parts of the world? Do you think, from your experience, that these journalists are better placed in terms of press freedom, independent journalists, or working only for particular communities? And the second is that I think in my research, one of the questions that keeps coming up, and in practice as well, is that then what about objectivity? Objectivity, which is quite a Western traditional journalistic norm. But let's just face it, like we would like to, and when I say we, I mean the Western norms would like to stick to a convenient way of doing things, or epistemic superiority in a way. But if we look at how things are changing on the ground.
I agree with advocating, by the way, that's a different subject, but it sounds like it's advocating, but actually what I mean by covering press freedom is essentially to look at a violation that is taking place where different state and democratic institutions are involved, targeting somebody who is there to do public service. If doctors were getting targeted, we'll write stories about them. And if rail workers were getting targeted, we would write stories about it. So when journalists are getting targeted, why
don't we write stories?
Because we have a problem of objectivity, by the way.
So exile journalists or working from.
So there are two very different questions. Okay, so the first question is more industry, and I want to say there's a good news. The best thing that you can do, from my perspective, and there are other professors here, they will tell you what to do. Don't listen to me, but I think that the landscape of journalism has already changed. It has been changing since the start of the century with the internet. But but it is drastically changing, and it's not what it was in the 90s, you know, in the last century, right? But we have been in journalism, as all institutions are, has been institutionalized, and there are certain things that are there, like this is how we publish, mainstream media, etc. But what's really happening, if you look closely, with AI coming up, and AI is here already, and what's really happening is that I think we are moving into a new ecosystem that we have to explore. And the tools that are available for that new ecosystem is independent journalism. You know, independent voices are important. You know, I wasn't 2 years ago even TikTok, but like my team was like, let's go on TikTok, and I was like, no way. But like I really understand now, looking at AI more closely, what's happening is that we are none of the people, like the public is not necessarily tuning into ABC News anymore. You know, no one's reading the New York Times anymore. Some people are, but you know, it's not the same. And so traditional media is changing. It's changing its platform, it's changing its vehicle, and it's changing its methodology and what people want to consume. So if you are an independent journalist and you can cultivate an audience based on your expertise, or you can collaborate with your colleague, like get 5 journalists together and start a channel, you are more likely to have an audience and to be able to do journalism than what would be consumed, you know, on the mainstream. I mean, Substack, there's so many examples, right? Right now, Mehdi Hassan, you know, like people like Mehdi Hassan, a lot of, you know, interesting journalists, experienced journalists are moving into these platforms because that's where the audience is going. Second thing I wanted to say about objectivity, again, that was an old school idea, and I think at that time we were not mature enough, right? We were just coming up with like journalism, you know, 2 centuries ago was a new thing. And at that time, objectivity was a good idea, because at that time we had to be detached from the story, we did not need to get affected by it, and actually stories did not affect us, because most of the journalism was done by elite, you know, white boys or etc. You know, elite men, you know, and as we have embraced diversity in the world, we have embraced like inclusion of women in our societies all over the world. And the entire dynamic of societies have changed. That brings more representation in journalism. That means that we have to evolve as a profession as well, which means objectivity essentially may not mean that you are detached from the story. It might mean that you dive in and then you come back to get your bearings and then discern whether what you want to write. I mean, I will say that it's not necessarily always a good idea to be too close to the story. You have to be intimate to the story, but if you're too close, then actually you do lose your ability to see the larger picture. So it's important to go dive in and come back out and then discern and then do journalism from that micro and macro perspective.
Yeah. So is there a line that should be or can be drawn between a journalist and a journalist and an activist? Can a journalist be an activist at the same time? Because you said keeping a critical distance. Is it possible to do it? I mean, again, for instance, if in my research on exiled journalists, for instance, I do not blame them for being so emotionally attached to the topic, because this becomes a matter of survival and for you know, not only for them but for the industry, for the country, for their people, and you know, this is identity, part of identity politics. So what do you think? I mean, there's no right and wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no right and wrong. We're all figuring it out because the world's changing really fast, right? So there are 2 things. Like, we'll go back to the idea of what is relative in that context. So first of all, activism is not the same as being an advocate for something, right? When you're an advocate, you have a principle, and journalists always have a principle. Journalism cannot exist if it's not public service. We are public servants first and foremost, and that's it, right? And then everything else. So once that you have that integrity as a journalist, to understand that your job is essentially to serve the people with information so that they can make their decisions. That's what journalism is. When you think like that, you automatically advocate towards certain things. which means that you would advocate against any kinds of human rights abuses, which is when you would cover human rights abuses in a way that a journalist should be covering, which means getting all sides right? You would automatically cover, and it was usually like that. We used to cover corrupt governments or bad politicians or bad states because we wanted to serve the public. Somehow we got carried away because of lack of training, etc. And I think not evolving enough at the right time is, I think that we have lost our understanding of what objectively is, right? Objectively is not detachment, and that's a problem. But you can advocate. I think inevitably journalists are, pro-democracy, we care about everyone, we want to get all the story right, we do our best. Dipping out of the story doesn't necessarily mean that we are being detached from it. It means that we actually want to make sure, scientifically everything, that all the facts are right. And we can do that when we are able to look from, a macro view. But then you have this other dynamic that is going on, where you have Taliban and ISIS and these other things that have taken over entire nations. Like Turkey right now has nothing other than an oligarch, other than a dictator. But Turkish journalists are completely caught up in that censorship, right? It's personal. Every single Turkish and Kurdish journalist has seen some sort of attack, press freedom attack. They've been beaten by the police, they've been taken into prison, right? And so it's not just like Taliban, it's like so many parts of the world are struggling with that. And I think, in Australia, I know some Australian indigenous journalists who have faced a lot of terrible incidents with authorities here. So when the story becomes you, then I think you have to collaborate with if you still want to do journalism, I think it becomes too personal. And I think it's important for our own psychological sanity that we collaborate with somebody who has not been affected by the story to get our bearings right.
Excellent. Yeah. I don't know how many of you cover, you followed the Pakistan and India military conflict that happened over a few days, mid-May. And I saw that a lot, and there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation from both sides, but also curtailment of the access to news. As a part of the diaspora, I was really struggling, looking for who should I trust, because there was a point when my home office was changed into a media monitoring site. There were different channels on different screens, and I was disappointed.
So much misinformation.
I was disappointed. I felt lost, not only as a researcher or a person who teaches media, but also someone who comes from that part of the world. And so I was craving for information, and I kept depending on mainstream media. Then that made me ask myself, why am I not trusting social media? Because in essence, there is a democratization of voice, so that's great, but there's also, a two-edged sword. There's so much happening. And then the role of independent journalists did definitely come up. But then, you were talking about journalists not being allowed to talk about this. But then how, and India is, on paper, it's a democratic country. It's so what can journalists do to still survive in that industry? Because it's so important to still stay in that industry.
I think there's a tough answer. And I want to go to some of the students who are here from China.
Yeah.
To sort of, this is a very good point, but I think you know the answer. Like, who's from China and would like to speak a little bit about you? Do you know what journalists do in China to report?
Actually, to say, journalists work for not only for the people. I think their main job is work for our country, not for the public people. Yeah.
Anyone else?
And based on that, I also want to ask you a question. Because I'm in China, all the media is not controlled but managed by the government.
Yeah.
I really want to ask the question that how you think the idea of the relative press freedom. Because in China, I couldn't say press freedom, to be honest. Cause
that's why I pointed to China, because that has been going on for a while. but I think people find ways of looking at information.
So this is
Yes,
why
go on.
I'm curious and I want to attend this conversation because I want to find out the answer. How can I do it? Because I want to be a journalist, but if I go back to China, I couldn't find the press freedom. I never can say the things I really want to express or to find out some story to uncover something. Because I need to follow the rules, follow the law. And as media student, the first class when I was in university, when I was an undergraduate student, my teacher told me, you are the mouth of the government. You can't say other things. So no defenses, but I just curious, how can I fight for the press freedom?
This is a very good example of what we are all kind of faced with. It's inevitable, and not everyone. I mean, I hope not in Australia and Europe and all that, but like a lot of parts of the world, right? That there is so much censorship and there's so much misinformation that you cannot have journalists who actually know about what's happening are not able to report. So how do you, like, how does common, like, I mean, I guess you as a journalist or academic can find ways, right? You can call some friends and say, hey, tell me what's going on, right? I mean, we have a group of like around 500 journalists in South Asia, so we get a lot of information. Everyone's like complaining about stuff. So I think in industry we have different ways of finding, but how do people find a way, to find good information? It really depends on, it's scary right now, and it really depends on the kind of country it is. Because censorship is not just through misinformation, like what happened in India and Pakistan. There was a lot of misinformation, and there was a lot of misleading information about war actually happening, which wasn't happening, that kind of stuff.
But as you said, sorry I'm cutting you, but here it's so important to point out that at the end, my main sources are people who were there to connect with them and call them because like, are you okay? This is what the media are reporting. I don't know if you're picturing, we're presenting a grim picture because it turns out that it's not just China. There are many other parts of the world where you actually cannot be a free press or journalist.
Yeah.
Sorry, you have.
I was just going to say that I don't give the current situation of press freedom is so intensely in decline that I would have to disagree with you that here in Australia, 100% there is self-censorship. And I don't know if you're familiar with
It's not that, it's not at the level of China.
No, of course
But
not.
it is there, but it's not, it's going to take a while for it to get there.
Oh yeah.
I don't think it's not inevitable.
No, it's part of the whole democracy is in decline all around the world, as press freedom is also in decline. There is now, as you know, I'm 20 years at the BBC. I'm so glad I don't work in mainstream media anymore, that I'm an academic, because the current genocide that we see, I couldn't continue working for an organisation.
And that's what a lot of
like the BBC or anywhere else.
say.
You have to be, do you want to be fired? Do you want to be blacklisted? And those are literally the choices that even we Western journalists in Western countries are facing. I don't know if there's a case about a journalist, I mean, you're probably not.
We have several in Australia, since the last 1.5 years, especially taking Gaza, taking that example. That's just one example. I mean, like I was saying, indigenous journalists, and there are other stories here that have been censored too. I think Gaza is a more intense, like, genocide level.
Yeah, exactly.
So we are talking about it more, but that censorship exists. But what I was trying to say is, like, China is like, has been, and Russia and the certain countries that have been at a level which is like, you cannot go back. And I think that Australia and Canada and we are getting a lot of reports from White House correspondents who are not able to report anymore. They are still going for due diligence, but every single day, all the White House correspondents, all the mainstream media is very well aware that this could be their last day of access. And so access gets lost. That's the first thing that happens. And then when your access gets lost, that kind of leads to further decline, right? But what I was just trying to say is, like, it's not there yet, which means it's maybe salvageable. Maybe we need to be, if we are able to do, and not exhausted.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. So just wanted to ask you, maybe if you can give an advice to the students regarding how to navigate these challenges. For example, a few months ago, El Salvador elected president, Nayib Bukele tweeted, "I'm the coolest dictator in the world," because he has a policy to put everybody that has tattoos or look like a gang member in jail. It's a terrorist, high security jail. There is no rights, but he's an elected president, and he's not the only case in Latin America. We have as well Milei in Argentina, for example, who comes with chainsaw,
yeah.
Guatemala, everywhere.
Yeah.
So how students, if they are going to be journalists in this kind of democratic, authoritarian regimes, to say something, how can they navigate and become journalists, being ethical journalists in this particular polarized world?
Unsafe.
Yeah. Unsafe as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a lot to ask to a journalist right now. I mean, I think it's a very tricky environment. And I think first thing that we have to establish is that to understand, to get our bearings around this question, is that what's happening to journalists is kind of happening to the world, right? And we are, I think maybe for the first time also realizing, we always used to think journalism, at least when I was a journalist, I was trained that we are not in the world, we're looking at the world, we are witnessing the world. So we are always witnesses in places that we are covering. But now we are in the world, and we are part of the same attacks that were not taking place because we had UN protections, because it was illegal to target journalists, because most even authoritarian governments used to be afraid of the West, putting sanctions or having bad relationships, or it would destroy foreign policy relations between governments if journalists were targeted somewhere, right? There's no such thing anymore. So that dynamic has changed because we are part of the world. So what we can do is to get that bearing and then figure out a new way of doing journalism, which really comes with using the tools that are there, right? I think that we do have some tools that come with technology and globalization. I think collaboration, interstate collaboration is like absolutely important if we want to do journalism, which is happening a lot. I don't know, I don't think Australian journalists are doing that as much because it's a little geographically far, but it's happening a lot in Europe.
It's a small world within the world.
Latin America, I mean, speaking of Latin America,
Yeah.
right, like you would have journalists who would, when they were put into prison or anything, like you would get somebody to come from the United States.
Yeah.
Like even a few years ago, we are a New York-based organization. We did a lot of successful advocacy work. We got journalists out of prison just by the mere fact that we could do advocacy from, based on where we were from. And now that's not possible. So that means that we need to improvise and collaborate with each other and also look away from traditional media. Not just, I think mainstream media is more under attack. I think there is an opportunity for people to connect with the public and create their own audiences, which sounds like a lot, but I don't think it's a lot. I think as long as we are trained really well in doing what we want to do, and we are connected with our protection system, peer support system is very important now. Are you guys familiar with that? Like, is that happening here?
Peer support.
Yeah.
Journalists.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
good.
That-
So
that-
it's
yeah.
very private.
Yeah.
I mean, on personal levels, on private levels,
That's
maybe,
something that's-
but
yes.
not.
There's a lot of organizations like we do that too, but Reuters and a lot of press freedom organizations are getting more involved, but also news organizations like Reuters, AP, New York Times, and all that. So, but I think that the solution is really that we have our basics right, that what journalism is, we understand that we're good reporting so we don't get anything wrong, and that we work together with each other. That would be the way to go. Of course, it sounds really crazy when you have legal attacks and journalists going to prison, etc., for which we have organizations that do the support work.
Yeah, so Sanskrit, I'll come to you. Yeah, so looks like in the West, journalists cannot speak for the public that are mostly authoritarian countries or authoritarian style democracies, as I like to call most of those countries. There's also another challenge of finances and business models and not having enough money to actually do the work. So yes, if I have a group of journalists who are willing to go and cover, and can cover, but I don't have the money to send them, for instance. I think there is a lot of research on independent or collaborative work among journalists to find some kind of sustainable model which works for both the industry but also. So does that, and going back to your question, political economy as well, who's controlling? I remember when I was struggling to decide which field I should go in. And there were people who would tell me, go to journalism if you want to be a powerful person in this part of the world, and that was Pakistan I'm talking about. If you want to have that power that you can actually abuse and no one's going to say anything to you, go into journalism. If they're not going to speak for the people who need to be spoken for, not at, so these people speak for themselves. Right? So is this how the future of journalism will be? Like, okay, I speak for myself.
You mean people themselves?
The public that is affected, or that needs to be spoken for, not
I
necessarily.
think journalism is a craft. You know, it's not, citizen journalism is helpful, but journalism is a craft. It's learned, you spend time, you get better, you get worse sometimes, and then you get better. It's a journey. And I don't think that people can be journalists. I think that we can have citizen journalism which helps push certain things.
Yeah.
It's an accessory, but it's not journalism, which is a pillar of democracy. And democracy is one system that accommodates rights of all people. So, and empowers people, right? So, and journalism is an important part of that system. I don't think without journalism we can have equality in the world, or we can have rights for all people in the world. The problems that people face, you know, also come because there's bad journalism, right? So, I mean, I don't know the answer of like what is the future. I think we are all kind of in a collapse of things at the moment. But I think the best thing journalists can do in this moment is try to cover that collapse, to witness that collapse, and to cover that collapse, and however we can. And I think that maybe sometimes we are very shy to collaborate. Like, we think collaboration is such a big idea, but it's not. I think it's an easy idea. It's accessible, and I think internet has, like, social media, TikTok, the infamous TikTok, has made it more accessible to the public. People are not interested in listening to news anchors anymore. You know, I love Christiane Amanpour, by the way. I think she's one of the legends, and I think she's really one of the good ones who's still around. But people are not watching Christiane Amanpour anymore. They're watching somebody on TikTok.
Is it because these, no matter how great their work is or how wonderful they are and how good they are at what they do, is it because people cannot relate to them? There's not a connection
problem.
And so that connection is found on vertical video?
I think people, I mean, there's a lot going on, right? Like, and people are caught up in conflicts right now. Polarization, that economy, everything's falling apart, right?
Social justice.
So that, you know, this goes into psychology a little bit, social psychology. but what's a human brain is changing, right? And changes every few decades. Our brains change drastically. I studied neuroscience as well. So our brains do change drastically every few generations, right? Every few decades. And I think we constantly have to adapt to that. And so in this environment too, our brains are changing. There's, at the one hand, there's a technology, so that's the reason. I think it's not that we have become more petty. I think our brain, the way your brain wiring works is different, and it's more relatable to younger people, especially, that they would listen to, you know, watch something on their phone, because they have literally grown in this. You know, I was born, I think when I was younger, we did not have PCs, right? Personal computers. So that's how old I am. My dad used to use a typewriter.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, like, I think so there has been a lot of changes, and that is something that we might want to.
It connects to social justice as well. Yeah,
You want to
yes,
say
sorry. Yes, but yes, Sanskriti had her. So Sanskriti, and then yes, we come to Kian, and then yeah. I think we're officially open the Q&A. So yes. Okay, yeah. Yes, Sanskriti, please.
I have a question. I don't know how much this falls within the main theme of discussion we're having today, but I can't help but ask you this because as a social media scholar who comes in contact with this more than often, I am bound to ask you what you think about how algorithmic bias and polarization and of course, their interrelationship is playing out online, and how is it that scholars like yourself are managing this to elevate the digital literacy? My housemate is Muslim and I'm a Hindu, and being a media scholar, I am more than aware, and my heart is always up when I'm consuming news, especially through social media, and we have pretty bare conversations on this. However, I have experienced this personally, that the streams of these news deliveries for her and I are polar opposites, and there's no way that I wouldn't self-victimize had I not been a media scholar. So my question to you is what we are doing as media scholars to disseminate that information and make people more digitally literate, especially in the younger generation. And the second question that stems from this is that how do you think this digital democracy is playing out for a country like India that is so culturally, religiously, politically complicated, given its digital revolution? How do you think, and whether or not this digital democracy is suitable or non-suitable for a nation?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so there's a lot of work happening. I mean, I say a lot, as much as is possible, on AI, and there are some good people who are actually advocates and activists for diversifying AI. Most of them are in the United States. I have some friends actually who started, or like non-profits that are just focused on advocacy for AI and research on AI to diversify AI, right? It has taken a lot of work, mostly because all the money is with the white boys who are in their 30s, and that's problematic. Not because they're white boys in their 30s, but because they don't have the experience to understand the world. They're not in the world, and they don't necessarily understand the importance of that. That's why it's a little bit reckless. But that's where the money is, and that's what is driving most of the work and research and development of AI, right? And by the way, majority of the development of AI has already happened. You know, we're way past that point. But what we can do is integrate. There is actually one interesting person. I recently spoke to somebody connected with her, Tracy, gosh, I'm forgetting her last name. But she is doing some work on AI. I think she recently wrote a book on AI as well in Australia. You should check her out. Tracy Spicer, former journalist and feminist, and she's been advocating for diversifying AI. But I think the work is like very little compared to where we are at and the kind of work we need to do. It is very dangerous in the sense that, like, I think it could be, we will see what AI would do and what kind of jobs they're going to give them, but obviously they're going to take up a lot of our jobs and make decisions. They'll be changing the ecosystem, and in that, when brown and black people and indigenous people are not accommodated or are not seen at the same length, then it's a problem. Yeah. And so what you can do, I just want to say one more thing, is like, we sometimes we are born in a society where everything's just given to us. You go to school, your parents tell you what religion you have to follow, like all the things are just told to us, and that shapes our mind. But I think we are at a time where everything's kind of shaking, and this is an opportunity to really ask, what can I do? Can I participate? Can I raise an issue that I'm bothered? Not like who's doing what, but like, what can I do? You can do something. You can gather a group of students and, in your spare time, do some work or volunteer for an advocacy organization or study the laws, or there's no laws, you can actually push for those laws. Call your public officials, make calls, write letters. There's a lot we can do as individuals.
And then AI mansplains as well. I would like
Totally.
there's research that has shown that it talks to you like a man, even if the answer is wrong, and you tell
Even
AI.
if it's the voice of a woman.
Yeah, even if it's exactly, that's deep intersection. And then you tell AI that no, this is not the answer to my question, and like, oh yes, sorry, I made a mistake. Not even sorry, I made a mistake. Yes.
Thanks, Kiran, for sharing your experiences and work in this area, especially with the problem of global press freedom. I was just curious what type of work you might have been doing in terms of trying to institutionalize some of these networks, because it appears that the one critical problem we have is the media business worldwide is imploding in terms of business models. And we have lots of little individual units, if you like, trying to produce. But we don't have any networking effect. We don't have any financial sustainability. And I think institutionalizing these types of networks is sort of handy, because I was just reflecting on this, and I know Ayesha knows about this case when I was jailed for my banned book.
Oh,
And
really?
getting support from the International Federation of Journalists, which I'm a member, and from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, was very useful. But you are talking about institutional support.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm thinking we have a lot of atomized units,
Yeah, totally.
but we don't have a
A
collaboration.
coalition. Yeah.
So I was curious what you
So
might be doing.
that's a very good point. I mean, so a lot of the advocacy work that has happened in the last few decades on press freedom, freedom of expression, organizations like PEN America, PEN International, Reporters Without Borders, advocacy work, Amnesty, all that, had happened. These are institutions that are set up, but I think that there had been a lot of, how do I say this politely, but there had been a little isolation. Everyone was working on their own. You must have experienced that. And when I was a journalist, that's what I experienced as well. There were help. I always got help, but not everyone did, and I knew that I was privileged to get that help. So accessibility had been a problem, but I think now, as things are changing, there is more intention in collaboration. What's most important is institutions that are working on advocacy, because there are few of us, and we don't have money, right? Like advocacy and press freedom organizations who are doing the advocacy work or support work, we don't have money. We don't have the money that the tech boys have, or the governments have, or the oligarchs have. So how do we have to be able to work together. So there's a lot of work that we are doing on collaborating with also other organizations, but also governments. The reason we started doing that work is to work with those institutions that can actually protect with their resources. So for example, in Canada, we've been trying to work with the Canadian government. We worked with PM Trudeau to sort of lobby for training the police so that the police is more aware that they cannot just arrest journalists because journalists are doing their job. So in Canada, the police doesn't understand, they keep on arresting and charging journalists, especially Indigenous journalists. So that's something that we've been working with the government, that we need to protect them, and that the law enforcement should be aware of the rights of journalists, right? That they are supposed to be there. So there are certain efforts of that kind. Transnational repression is one of the issues we've been working on with several governments, so that we can get law enforcement again involved in protecting journalists who are targeted by foreign governments like China, Russia, Turkey, etc., Pakistan. So that kind of work, I think, is going to be effective in the long run, as long as we have some semblance of a democracy. But we are also kind of facing a time where we don't know what's going on, because coming back to the finances, journalism doesn't have any money. The entire industry is really like, somebody was calculating it, and I think somebody said that it's like 40% less money in journalism in the last few years alone, and that doesn't count the decade, which, because it has been declining for a very long time. So, only yesterday, Washington Post laid off the entire video staff. So our our team was looking at how many of them were women, because a lot of times these layoffs involve more, like have more women in them. But like, that is a problem, right? And that is not something that journalists can control. What we can do, or advocacy organizations can't do anything about, what we can do is improvise and try to find ways of working with people who do have the money and who do have the resources. That is something that we are trying to work on.
And when journalism...
Can I follow up?
Yeah, yeah.
Really, my question is really connect what you're saying and how it is changing, this scenario for civil society and media organizations. So we saw that a lot of the money that, news organizations, civil society had came from USA. And then all the policies that, Trump is pushing, like the DEI, it's like pushing combination of this money to civil society and things like that. And this is affecting your work. And that's what I would be interested in, how this is going to be related to. I think also this tour around the world that you're doing, trying to push other governments to help. Because I think the future for journalism is really like, they became so dependent of US aid in their intermediaries, right? With internews and organizations that were receiving a lot of money, ICFJ, which were receiving a lot of money. I remember I was talking to someone from ICFJ, which I shouldn't have shared here. Anyway, they were saying like more than 80% of their money was coming from US aid. And then now they don't have this money. And they had this idea of like kind of creating a new organization that was basically merging with Africa Check, because they would have the Africa Check money for the global south, and they would have
It's a
money
big
from
problem in philanthropy generally. I don't like that problem, but yeah, it's that. Because go on.
No, and my question was like, how we can, not organizations, civil society organizations, big organizations, can think about this future, like, and help, like, as your organization, all the journalists around the world, in a scenario that we became so dependent of this government, US government. And then a lot of these organizations are in US because they could get money from US. And now this money is over, and we don't know if it's going to come back one day. And at least, at least 2-3 years, it's going to be really bad. And then we are in a situation that, like how this scenario of freedom can happen when we don't even have money to push this agenda anymore.
So first of all, I think that, so I think that one, if you look at it, has anyone had economics in their courses?
I love it.
Sociology? Okay, like just generally like how systems work is these are just examples of little things that are part of a bigger ecosystem that's changing. So then everything's getting affected by that bigger ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
And so to improvise, we have to understand what is that bigger ecosystem and where is that going, right? And once we understand, so for example, polarization is growing, authoritarian governments are coming to power, and why is that happening? It's happening because people are not happy. It's happening because people have not had their rights for a very long time. So it really comes back to the fabric of like where people are at, right? And these are important dynamics to understand. To understand, A, why do I want to do journalism? Why is journalism important? B, where will journalism get money from? And C, who's got the money, right? And so I don't think that like like any organization that has, whoever's lost money that's a problem. Obviously there's consequences. We lost our money as well. We lost a lot of our donors because of our Gaza work. Work to support Palestinian journalists, and we supported Israeli journalists. Any journalist who's targeted, we support them. But like that is just a symptom of the problem. We have to look at what is the bigger problem, what is the bigger picture. And that's where we can start coming, to make some understanding of what's happening. I do think that there is still a lot of money in the world. And I do think that there's a lot of rich people who are not like Elon Musk.
Where are they?
They're there. It's just that we are disconnected from each other. The world is so disconnected from each other, but they're there. And we have to,
I think it takes us to
do a bird call.
Yeah, or a question of moral responsibility or social responsibility.
Exactly.
Lucia? Yes? You have a question?
Yes.
And then
When e-books is collected from social media and organizations are having bad brutal. And all the newsrooms have so much stress that they cannot have enough time to fact checking. And even journalists do not go to report, to witness the event they need to talk about. And combined with the curriculums, I think in the universities and in the academias that are laser focused to be specialized in one thing and not to study about economy, maybe philosophy, psychology, as we did before. We did politics, economics, ethics, history, all those things, mathematics even. What will be the impact of all this combination to freedom, press freedom, ethical journalism, and also truth-telling, because that's our job.
So I think there are two things. One is a reality that, like, obviously the industry is, getting crushed. Not like press freedom attacks is one thing, but actually financial problem is one of the biggest problems, because if we would have resources, we would be able to defend ourselves. But what's happening is that journalists are working on survival mode everywhere, right? I mean, right now, even White House correspondents are in that situation, right? So what do we do in that environment, right? We do obviously need resources to be able to do the work in that environment. But I think that it's going back to the same thing that I said before. I think that's a bigger problem that's happening. And I think we are all together seeing it's not just like what's happening to the media, is also happening to politicians. It's also happening to people who actually care about democracy and democratic institutions. They're facing the same problem. They're getting crushed. There's no money. Bad people are coming to power, and they're taking over. So we are kind of, as a species, going through some things. What we can do in this moment, I think journalists are doing, and this is my second point. Journalists are resilient people, right? I think most of the time, if you spend 5 years or 10 years, I think even 5 years could give you such a solid nervous system that yes, you are under stress, but you don't forget your values, I think. I think most journalists don't after experiencing the witnessing, because journalists have a privilege that we get to connect with people. And there's a psychological, biological change that happens in a journalist when we do that. We don't talk about it in the industry. There should be a course about how does a body change, a human body change, a psychological body change for a journalist. Because when we connect with other people to try to understand their problems, we change as people. We become more resilient, we become tougher. And I think that as long as this problem exists only, that we want to tackle as a newsroom, I think we have all the skills that we need to be able to do that, as long as we want to do it. And some of us don't want to do it, and that's totally okay for them.
I've got a question. We talked about authoritarian countries and their press freedom is in decline. When did it start in the Western media? Because we literally can see a news report reported very differently when we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, and the next story, or the one preceding it, was about Gaza and the language used. And this is all on mainstream news. And these guys are much younger, they probably don't watch it. People my age, probably same cohort as you, we still watch the news. So we are seeing it in real life, in real time. You're seeing the disparity in reporting. When do you think this change? I mean, from my experience, I think COVID did push a lot of this mistrust in mainstream media, but from your experience as you're in the industry, where would you say this decline in Western media started?
So that's a very good question, because I think I think we in the industry have a lot of theories about COVID being it, but it was way before COVID, right? I've looked into it a little bit out of curiosity, pun intended. So in reality, I think there was a basis of the system that was already there to, journalists and media, we're all like human beings, so we are psychological beings in a way, right? Information sharing is all about how we, what we're thinking and how we get curious with our mind. So if you look at the Western media, and you're talking about Western media, right? So if you look at the Western media, since World War II, after, in the post-colonial world, what journalism was, is we go there, okay? And there was always this idea that we are fine, there's democracy here, but we go there. And we cover poor African children, and we cover authoritarian China, etc., etc., etc. And the entire stories of like African countries, Latin America, like their stories have been told incorrectly from that, colonial prism. So that was the first basis of being biased and being okay with not telling the whole story. And I think that, it's been unintentional for most journalists who work in the Western media. They were unaware that when you're going to go and cover Iraq war from a foreign policy perspective, from what America should be, that's a bias, that's as biased as it gets. But that has been there, and I've been my entire career was unfortunately working for American press, and I did cover, I'm able to reflect, but I did cover things because at that time I was, as a journalist, trained that, this is how you're going to cover the drone war, this is how we're going to look at the Peshmerga, etc., right? And I think journalists it's not intentional, but it's coming back to being psychological beings. That has been going on, but I think as we are evolving, as things are changing, now we have the other enemy, which is AI, it is a time to reflect, and I think newsrooms are kind of reflecting on it to a certain extent. What we saw during COVID, or during the Iraq war, like there were these waves that you saw, like the media really being biased, was just certain symptoms that we saw that, these are big stories, and we saw a more pronounced version of what you're talking about. But I think that it started from the very beginning of what, the boom of journalism, which was World War II, post-World War II, and yeah.
And if I could just add to this, yes, from World War II, because propaganda started, basically at that time, and radio was used for that for most instances. But when it really came up to the world was during the Vietnam War, and that's when journalists themselves. So one of the journalists, you might want to search him up. Walter Cronkite was the person who first came on the media and said, he ended his entire 1-hour show and said, "What are we doing?" Something along the lines, right? And that's when the public started questioning. And so there was, as she said, there was these discrepancies always, but on the face, they weren't there. And so Vietnam War is when these things got really exposed. My observation is also that 9/11 really also was that.
Yeah, these are these
nail,
big events.
and then the waves, the Gulf War and
I think that somebody said, like in China, and that's an example of how it has been in America too, is that if you are a journalist and you think that I was born and raised in Pakistan where I started my career, if I'm going to say I'm a Pakistani journalist, I'm already putting an identity. I've never believed myself to be any journalist associated with any country. Because I think when you become a journalist, you don't really think where you're from. Your job is essentially to witness and understand.
Yeah.
And you try to understand what is the context of this story, of the people involved in the story, of their history, etc., etc. You're not thinking, So if you're thinking that, which has happened to American journalism and British journalism, and some of European so much better, but was the first problem when we started saying, oh, this is how we cover Afghanistan, and this is how Afghans should behave because America likes, these are our values. And
it's a great conversation, but we've got only time for 2 questions because I know we've really exhausted you, and I'll treat you with good food after this. So, Janvi, and then Sanskriti, and sorry, do you have a question? Tiffany, okay. So, yeah, okay.
I'm fine with not asking and maybe having a...
Yeah, maybe we have, of course, Kiran's over here. Yeah, we're not letting her go until everyone's asked everything. So, yeah, maybe Janvi, we can ask that follow-up question, and then Tiffany.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what was discussed before about how, you've mentioned Walter Cronkite, and I used to, be really interested, and I used to say, and that's the way it is. and it talks about like, you know, consonants in reporting issues and like the colonial method of reporting issues that aren't Western issues. And the thing with that is very interesting was the other day, I was looking at this channel, but it was on TikTok, and it was about this independent journalist, and she was in a country. I don't remember what country it was because that's like the extent of, you know, attention economy. That's only watched the video. I don't know the question there. But she was looking at this individual. She was looking at the sustainable practices that are conducted in South Africa and are conducted in the communities for, you know, more sustainable practices, such as there was this biogas experimentation that was happening by, you know, the community, where this person looked at waste that was taken from plastic and was making, like, they were making homes out of it, they were making energy out of it, they were looking at compost and how that can be converted into energy. And when we look at, you know, the consonants in reporting, we don't see that in mainstream because these particular and unique issues are only covered by independent journalists that like seek to, you know,
that's very hyper local.
Yeah, it's really hyper local, but then it's so hard. How do you enter into the following of mainstream media, but with the knowledge of independently nurtured local, like independent journalists?
Yeah. So like going back to the 2 points I made. One is that take what's relevant.
Right.
So if there's something relevant in the mainstream media, you can take that. But I really think at this moment, there is a very, very solid, good place for independent media and journalists, like really good journalists doing really good journalism through their own channels, because mainstream cannot cover certain things.
But how do you establish credibility in that environment? Because amongst other journalists who have been a part of, you know, experiencing, you know, mainstream media, like
how do you establish that credibility? Oh, when you're doing good journalism, everyone wants a piece of you.
And over time, it happens over time.
It happens over time, but I think sometimes it happens if you're a good journalist, every other journalist likes to, we learn a lot. We are constantly learning from each other, constantly. We're constantly also stealing each other's work, also very colonial thing to do.
But yeah, no, but going back to your point about collaboration, some of the best journalism with the most social impact, morally and socially responsible journalism has come out of collaborations that have happened. Yeah. Tiffany.
Yeah, my question is about the funding for your journalism. You said about there are threats that some of the funds are being withdrawn if their voice are not biased or not favoring them. And my question is, what do you think is the future for the funding? You talked about there are rich who exist that are not like Elon Musk. Is that the only source of funding, or is there other source? How do you make sure that they are not going to jeopardize your fairness and your objectivity?
So I think we are also in economic times, if you may, right? The economies are changing, right? So the money is going away from journalism and some, very democratic institutions. But then, no one wants taxes anymore. People don't know why taxes are taken from the first place. There's a purpose for taxes. But anyways, I don't like the whole anti-tax conversation because I think taxes have a purpose. They create resources and facilities, but people are not aware of that. But to answer your question is that, there are alternative ways, but they're so new that it's scary to get into it. So for example, you can create through your own, most of the independent journalists that I know, they're able to also have public support. They get funding from people. There's lots of good journalists, especially in Western countries, where you have reasonable economies and it's not like a country with, where people are not buying the news or they're not interested in the news. There's a lot of independent news organizations, very small, 4-staff organizations. I know hundreds of them who are indigenous journalists who started a news organization, for example, or independent journalists, who do their own thing and they get their audience to pay, a fee. Substack is a platform where essentially independent journalists go and they ask for a little fee for you to subscribe to their channel, and And so it seems like it might not be beneficial to do that, but lots of people are doing that. And it means that people are supportive, which is why, you know, I kept on saying, go to the, like, I'm an old school person. I would never say go to TikTok. But now I think the landscape is changing, and it seems like, yeah, these platforms, alternative platforms, are the place where you can do independent journalism.
And that's where
And
the
you can
audience
get
is.
audience.
So
You
the
can
audience
get
is there. And just to add to that subscription thing, that's also one of the differences that I've noticed over the last 20 years is that growing up, we always paid for news. News was never free for us. But now people don't want to pay for news. Not because they want to hold on to a few dollars, it's because it's almost an alien concept to think, should I pay because there's so much news, so much information, and if they're getting it free, why should I be paying? And as I said, growing up, we always paid for news. Some of the best are just a $1 subscription, and it's a very minimal subscription, and I don't know, we cannot cover them with tax returns anyway, but
you could. There's a lot of non-profit, you know, a lot of independent journalists do the non-profit registration, so they give tax receipts.
Yeah,
And you can. There's lots of new newsrooms, especially like that are like very specific to a topic or a niche, that are non-profit newsrooms.
Well, I think I'll finish on one of Arundhati Roy's comment about the fact that the human brain was never designed to consume so much information, and we are bombarded with information, you know, right, left, top, center, everywhere. And not only because this is forced on us, somehow we have decided that this is what we have to do. We have to know everything. We have to, which is great. I mean, I for one would like to know everything. Maybe AI can help us in that. But yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me personally is that choose what you want and what's relevant. So once again, thank you so much for you all have been a wonderful audience, and of course if you've got any questions ever, you
Send it to her.
and I will, but yeah. Yes, I think we should take a photo if that's okay.
Yeah.
With who, yeah?